Canada hit back. When the United States raised tariffs, Ottawa answered with tariffs of its own. Provinces pulled American alcohol from their shelves. Canada raised the cost of bringing certain U.S. vehicles across the border. Then Washington reached for a weapon almost nobody was watching. On July 20th, the White House invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 and announced an additional 50% duty on nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods, scheduled to take effect August 19th. But the 50% is not the most important part. The important part is what Washington chose to hit, what it chose not to hit, and what that difference reveals about Canada's position in this trade fight. Because Canada does have leverage over the United States. It just does not have the same leverage everywhere. Section 338 is almost a century old. It allows an American president, after finding that another country is discriminating against U.S. commerce, to impose additional duties of up to 50%. If that discrimination continues or increases, the statute goes even further. Under certain conditions, it allows the president to exclude products from that country entirely. For decades, that power was essentially dormant. Then, in February, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act did not authorize the president to impose tariffs. One major route for broad executive tariffs had been closed. 5 months later, Section 338 appeared. And this time, Canada was the target. The White House issued 3 proclamations, one focused on motor vehicles, one on dairy, one on alcoholic beverages. The administration's argument was straightforward. Canada had imposed special treatment on American vehicles, maintained dairy quota practices Washington considered discriminatory, and most Canadian provinces and territories had stopped buying or selling U.S. alcohol while continuing to sell products from other countries. From the Canadian side, much of this did not appear out of nowhere. The auto measures were part of Canada's retaliation against earlier U.S. tariffs. The liquor removals were also a political response to the trade conflict. That is the first irony. Measures designed to create Canadian leverage became part of the legal justification for a new American weapon. But the second irony is bigger. Canada and the United States already have a free trade agreement. CUSMA, or USMCA, south of the border, is supposed to define the rules of North American trade. Companies spend enormous amounts of money organizing supply chains around those rules. A product qualifies. Its origin is documented. Preferential treatment follows, except not here. The new Section 338 duties explicitly apply to the covered goods, even if those goods qualify as originating under USMCA. In other words, for the products on this list, the certificate that normally opens the free trade door does not remove this new 50% charge. That does not mean CUSMA is meaningless. It does not mean every Canadian export suddenly faces 50%. And it does not mean this tariff is legally untouchable. It means something narrower and more revealing. A trade agreement is not a force field. It protects trade within a legal architecture. Section 338 is a different part of that architecture, one that almost nobody expected to become central to Canada-U.S. commerce in 2026. Now, look at the list. If this were simply about punishing Canadian cars, milk, and alcohol, the tariff schedule would be easy to understand. It is not. The covered products stretch into furniture, cement, clothing, swimming pools, fishing equipment, hockey sticks, and other machinery and consumer goods. Nearly $20 billion of Canadian imports are exposed, roughly 5% of what the United States bought from Canada last year. That is large enough to hurt individual industries, plants, exporters, and communities, but it is also small enough to reveal something important. Most Canadian trade is not on this list. Energy is excluded. Potash is excluded. Certain critical minerals and fish are excluded. Products already subject to Section 232 measures are excluded from these particular Section 338 duties. Civil aircraft also receive separate treatment. The exemptions matter because Canada's strongest bargaining chips are not evenly distributed across the economy. The United States can buy a Canadian hockey stick from somewhere else, or an importer can decide that 50% makes the product too expensive. Replacing Canadian crude oil, natural gas, potash, electricity, or certain minerals can be much more complicated. Canada is deeply integrated into American energy and industrial systems. In 2025, the United States was still taking roughly 4 million barrels of Canadian crude oil per day. Canadian natural gas crossed the border at an average of roughly 8.5 billion cubic feet per day. That is real leverage, but it is concentrated leverage, and on the Canadian side, the dependence is broader. In 2025, about 72% of Canada's merchandise exports still went to the United States. That share actually fell from the year before. Canada sold more to non-U.S. markets, and the non-U.S. share reached its highest level in more than 4 decades. That sounds like diversification. But even Canada's own trade analysis adds an uncomfortable detail. A large part of the improvement outside the United States came from gold and energy. strip out the exceptional boost from gold, and replacing the U.S. market becomes much harder. A country can sign more trade agreements. It cannot move an Ontario factory closer to Europe. It cannot instantly replace decades of highways, pipelines, rail lines, power connections, supplier contracts, and customers built around a market sitting directly beside it. That is the weak spot. Not that Canada has nothing the United States needs. It clearly does. The weak spot is that Canada depends on one customer across a much wider part of its economy than that customer depends on Canada, and that changes how retaliation works. If two countries impose equal tariffs on equal amounts of trade, the pain is not automatically equal. The country with more alternative customers, more domestic demand, and more supplier options can absorb the fight differently from the country whose factories were built around one dominant destination. This is why the current dispute is more interesting than the headline number. 50% sounds like the story. It is not. The story is that Washington found a legal tool capable of reaching Canadian products that would otherwise qualify for a preferential North American trade treatment, then aimed that tool at a relatively narrow slice of Canadian commerce while leaving several strategically important flows outside it. That is not proof that every exemption was chosen because Washington fears Canadian leverage. Some categories are excluded because they already sit under other tariff regimes. Others are explicitly carved out in the proclamations. But the resulting map is still revealing. Canada's leverage is strongest where the United States has built systems around Canadian supply. It is weakest where a Canadian producer simply needs access to an American customer. And there's another complication. Section 338 has never been tested like this. This is the first known use of the provision to impose tariffs. The Supreme Court struck down one tariff authority earlier this year, and this new approach enters largely untested legal territory. So this is not an unstoppable weapon. It is an untested one, and that uncertainty is part of the pressure. A Canadian exporter does not need to know how a future court case ends. It needs to know what tariff applies when its shipment crosses the border. Negotiators have been trying to reach an agreement before August 19th. A deal could reduce, delay, or remove the new duties. But even if that happens, something has already changed. Canada has now seen how quickly the assumptions underneath free trade can be challenged when the political relationship changes. For 30 years, geography looked like an advantage. The richest market in the world was next door. Supply chains became shorter. Factories became integrated. Selling south was easier than selling across an ocean. Efficiency rewarded concentration. Then concentration became exposure. Canada hit back. Because retaliation was supposed to create bargaining power. Washington's response revealed the harder truth. Canada has leverage, but leverage is not the same thing as independence. And until Canada can sell more of what it makes to more than one dominant customer, every trade fight with the United States begins with the same structural imbalance. The tariff is the headline, the weak spot is the story. You're watching Hoch, documentary stories about the systems that shape the modern world.